Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young. And it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Good morning, Carl. It's so cool to have you on my podcast since I've had the pleasure of joining you on yours a couple times.
Yeah, it's great. It's good to be here, Karen.
And I know we talked about your biography of Jill Craigie before on your podcast, but I wanted to let you introduce her and some of the complexities of that story writ large to my readers and listeners. I realized that this had come back to mind because I was reading someone else's list of, best books of 2024. And I thought it'd be really good to do a desert island, the books I'd take with me on a desert island, favorite books. And I realized that amongst all the biographies on my shelf, this is the one, To Be a Woman, that I would take with me for sure. So please, just where did that start? It started long before it started, really.
Yes, that's right. One of the things you said about desert island discs reminds me that I had a neighbor who was not particularly literary or interested in the film world, but she did read some of my books, and Jill Craigie was always her favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting, too, because she was very conservative politically, and Jill Craigie was not, of course. I first met Jill Craigie and her husband, Michael Foote, in the early 1990s when I was writing a biography of Rebecca West. And both Jill and Michael had known her, so they were people I wanted to interview. And Jill, in fact, really fell in love with Rebecca West and convinced feminist publishers, Virago Press, to bring some of Jill Craigie's Rebecca West writings back into print. So I had that connection with Michael Foote and Jill Craigie. And
Give us,
Michael,
what years were
sure.
this? Let's just have some context here.
You mean the years of Jill and
Well,
Rebecca?
when Rebecca, yeah.
Jill sort of rediscovered Rebecca West in the 1970s, really, and wrote her sort of a fan letter and visited her flat in Kingston House in London. And they really hit it off. Jill was very interested in the feminists, which we'll be talking about, the votes for women movement. And Rebecca West's early writing was all about feminism, going back to 1912, 1913. Very outspoken feminist, and her writings, the early Rebecca writings, have been collected, and people can read them. They're still available. So that's where Jill really got interested in Rebecca West. There were women beginning to rediscover her. She had kind of fallen out of favor because she was really a rabid anti-communist. You could not call her a conservative, though some of Rebecca West's opinions, certainly conservatives were very fond of. In fact, Doris Lessing told me when I interviewed Doris Lessing, who also knew Rebecca West in later life, she said, for many years I didn't read Rebecca West. I was kind of turned off because Lessing had been involved in radical politics. And West politics by that point simply didn't fit current trends. So Jill had to do a lot of heavy lifting, get these women at Virago say, just read her. Just give her a read and you'll see how remarkable she is. West was a great wit. She said, writing about Winston Churchill, this is back around, again, 1912, 1913, and West said, Winston Churchill proves that there are some souls for whom the devil does not care to pay a price. That's a good example of Rebecca West's wit. She was, early 20s.
Yeah.
when she was
Yeah.
writing these things. Anyway, uh, we went out to dinner. That is, I went out to dinner
Mhm.
with Michael Foote and Jill Craigie, and we just hit it off. They were just wonderful people, and went over to their home in Hampstead. And Jill showed me the scrapbook of Rebecca West. And there was actually this notation. Rebecca West was born on December 12th, 1913. And what Rebecca West meant by that, she wasn't born in 1913, but that's the name she adopted as her pen
Yes.
name. Her name was Cicely Fairfield. And Rebecca said at one point, in referring to her pen name, she said, Cicely Fairfield. No one's going to take anyone called Cicely Fairfield seriously. She said, I might as well be called Thistledown Dewdrop. Uh, so, I mean, it was very, very difficult, unless you really got on the bad side of Rebecca West, not to just absolutely fall in love with the woman.
Mhm.
And that's what Jill did. So anyway, I published this biography of Rebecca West in 1996, and I went on to do a biography of Susan Sontag with my wife.
Mhm.
And we were just finishing up that book when one day, in fact, I went to look it up because my memory's a terrible thing for a biographer to confess, but I don't have a good memory. And I say things and then I wonder, did it really happen or did it happen when I said it happened? That sort of thing, which constantly checking the people I'm writing about because
Yeah.
they often get it wrong.
They get it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was this headline in the New York Times, December 19th, 1999. Jill Craigie, 85. Her age actually is wrong there. Jill Craigie, 85, film director and devoted British socialist. It was an obituary.
Mhm.
I just want to read the first paragraph because it just hit me between the eyes. Jill Craigie, a devoted socialist and feminist who became one of Britain's first successful female film directors, and whose half-century marriage to the Labour Party leader Michael Foot put her at the heart of the country's leftist politics, died on Monday in London. She was 85. I read that. The obituary is quite long. I was quite
Mhm.
surprised because
Mhm.
almost nobody in the United States knows even who Jill Craigie is,
Yeah.
and maybe not Michael Foot either. And so I just, it went on for quite a while. And but it was that first paragraph instantaneously. I thought, as I said, we had just finished working on
Mhm.
Susan Sontag. I got to write her biography. When
Huh.
I met Jill back in the middle 1990s, I knew very little of what was in the obituary. I knew her as a friend of Rebecca West's, and Michael Foot had just retired from Parliament
Mhm.
about a decade earlier. He had been leader of the Labour Party, trounced by Margaret Thatcher
Yeah.
in an election. And then I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I immediately wrote him a letter and said, it's probably premature, Michael. And he hadn't just been welcoming. He had written this biography of H.G. Wells, and he has this long footnote about my Rebecca West book telling
Huh.
everybody they've got to read it. So I thought I'd have a receptive person on the other end when I wrote to him. And I said, it's probably too early. Your wife has just died, but I'm really interested in doing her biography. Oh, I thought he was going to write me back. He called me up
Uh-huh.
from London. I was in New Jersey. And he says, "Oh, you must come and she was working on a book that she hadn't finished, and all her papers are in the house. And anytime you come to London, you can stay with me if you want to do the biography."
Mm.
And so 3 months later, in March 2000, there I was on his doorstep in Hampstead, saying, "Hi, Michael,"
With your
and
suitcase in your hand, I
with
assume.
my suitcase in my hand because I stayed in his library.
Mhm.
He had a pull-out sofa bed in the library, and I made 9 trips to London over about two and a
Mhm.
half, 3 years, interviewing him, sitting in her study, looking out at the garden which she had created, going through her drawers. They had no filing system, either husband or wife. And so he gave me the run of the house, which is a good
Mhm.
thing, because I went into their bedroom and I found,
And found
letters and
papers. You've told
papers
me that, and
all
I've
over
heard
the
it
place.
from one of their assistants that everything was just packed in everywhere.
Yeah, it was just amazing. So Michael couldn't have been more welcoming. One of the things he was worried about that didn't worry me one bit, but it gets to a point about biographies as far as I'm concerned. He was worried that she was too small of a subject after having done people like Rebecca West and Susan Sontag.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jill had been a journalist. Yes, she had been a filmmaker, but she wasn't, a renowned filmmaker. I mean, she wasn't
Mm-hmm.
making films later in life. It was mostly during the Second World War. And she was mainly known in England as his wife, which wasn't really doing justice to her. But nevertheless, that's the way, people knew
Yeah,
her.
I hadn't really thought about that, but in fact, she was
Yeah.
kind of
And
first
if
lady in
right.
the Labor Party
That's right. And
during
when you
those
look
years.
at when you look at one of the biographies of Michael Foote and you look in the index, there's no Craigie there. It's Foote, Jill Foote.
Uh-huh.
She's robbed even of, her professional name,
Yeah.
Craigie. So he was worried
Uh-huh.
that I would, run out of material or, whatever. And I told him, Michael, you don't have to worry about that. Jill is a fascinating subject. And it gets to what I feel about biography. I mean, my American agent said, I'll never be able to sell this book. And she didn't. What happened was it was sold in England. And eventually, when we got into the age of, self-publishing and desktop publishing, actually my American agents were able to do a deal with iUniverse, which was getting into self-publishing and
Uh-huh.
books out of print and that kind of thing. So it finally did get a somewhat limited American audience. But I didn't care. And someone once said this to me at the NYU biography seminar. A fellow biographer said to me when I was working on Dana Andrews. Now, Dana
Mhm.
Andrews was a big star in the 1940s, but I would guess for most people, if they don't really know their
Yeah,
Hollywood
I
film,
hadn't
Dana
known his
Andrews
name.
means nothing.
Yeah,
The
I had.
Clark Gable they would
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
Gary Cooper they would know, but
Mhm.
Dana Andrews, even though he was a big star in the 40s, most people I think would not know him. And she said to me, she said, "Isn't Dana too small of a subject for you?" And I never thought someone would say that to me. I mean, I was just a fellow biographer. I just didn't know
Mhm.
what to say. Later, I had my reply. My reply was, there aren't any small subjects. There are only small biographers.
I love that approach, and God knows there is plenty in Jill's story to engage. I
Yeah.
can see why it engaged you, and it engages me, and I came back to it just in preparing to talk to you, and I'm reading a line that says, when Jill was not reading Sylvia on the Suffragettes, that's Sylvia Pankhurst, I think,
Pankhurst. Yeah.
she was reading Lewis Mumford. And I thought,
Yeah.
I mean, that says something about who she was.
Yeah. That was Jill. I mean, she had this incredible aesthetic sense, which drew her not only toward film, but toward architecture, to what she called the village green, to things on a human scale, which Mumford was
Mhm,
interested in. And Jill was like Nye Bevan in the Labor Party. They
mhm.
all were entranced with Lewis Mumford. They invited him to come over and speak to them. They were terribly interested. Jill fascinated me because she came really from nothing. Um, she had no advantages to speak of growing up, and she came to London at a very young age. And there was actually a gap of 3 years in her life between 18 and 21 where I could find almost nothing. And I said to the novelist Francis King, I said, I've got to write about this period, whether I have any evidence or not, because I know so much about her later, and I know her feelings about men and being in the big city and men sort of hitting on you and all that kind of stuff. I said, how do I recreate that? I said, you know of a novel, and he came up with one. It's that one by, I'm trying to think of the novelist's name. It's about a girl in early 20th century London, and it completely recreates that sort of the psychological state of a girl who's got to somehow make it on her own. And so I was just terribly fascinated with that, and
I'm going to
thought,
come
well, how
back
do
to
we?
you about that because Valerie
Yeah,
Elliott was the same, and there's a very significant gap. And she was in the same
Death of the
position.
Heart is the title of the novel. Death of the
Oh,
Heart, Elizabeth Bowen.
oh,
I've reached that age where the naming center is going.
oh.
But it's
Wow.
the death of the heart, and
Yeah.
it just opened
Hmm.
up what
Hmm.
the world was like for a
Yeah.
young woman at that
Yeah.
age in
And
that
she was
period
a
in London.
beautiful young woman, too.
She was beautiful, so some men would follow her on the street.
Not true of Valerie. So, I mean, we have a different,
Yeah, it was it
but
was
that's
yeah,
important. Yeah.
yeah. And Jill had to. Well, one of the things she did, I mean, she was beautiful, but she also stayed young as long as she could. And part of what that meant, just like often movie stars have done, is she shaved some years off her age. She was born in 1911, and all the obituaries said 1914 because that's the name, that's the date that she went by. I had this conversation with her when we were talking about Rebecca West, and she said, "Oh, who else have you worked on?" And I said, "Oh, Lillian Hellman." "Oh, interesting figure," Jill says. I said, "Yeah." And I said, "You know what I found out? That Hellman lied about her age, that she made herself younger." And Jill took umbrage at this. Not that it wasn't true, but that she said, well, listen, if you were born in Lillian Hellman's time, you might very well want to shave a few years off your. I don't hold that against her, and I did. And certainly, when I found out, I saw the death certificate, and then later the birth certificate, Jill's birth certificate. This was something that her husband never knew, and when I told him that, he wouldn't believe me.
Mm. Yes, we need to talk about the Michael Foot's reaction because, as you said, he was incredibly welcoming and eager for you to do it, but it became a little complicated later
Oh
on.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but what would you like to talk about that now, or should we talk about? It would be nice to get a sense of the trajectory of her life
Yeah,
because the
yeah,
way she became interested in the suffragettes, the right to vote movement, and then how that influenced her life, I think is really important.
yeah. I think what happens is Jill gets married at a early age to a man from a well-connected, wealthy family with the name of Claude Begbie Clench.
Oh,
Uh,
gorgeous.
just a sort of classic hyphenated English name. One of Jill's childhood friends, who I was able to actually, her stepdaughter, one of Julie's childhood friends during the Second World War, when they would refer to Jill Craigie's first husband, Claude, the girlfriend would like to say, "Oh, you mean Claude Begbie Stench?" Uh, and what's funny about that is not just the stench part, but the sense of class.
Mm.
Here's someone who's from the upper class. You should see their wedding photo with Claude Begbie Clench, black tie and tails sort of thing,
Yeah.
the formality of that world. And Jill, her mother was Russian, her father was Irishman. The marriage didn't go
Yeah.
well, and so she was really the daughter of a loveless marriage,
Hmm.
and finds herself in London. The marriage to Claude doesn't work out. He's an alcoholic. And what we probably should segue to is really to the 1930s
Hmm.
when she meets Jeffrey Dell, who is a lawyer. He's a barrister, but he wants to write for the movies. And he does write for the movies, and that's Jill's entree into the movies through her
Hmm.
husband.
Hmm.
And she starts writing scripts with him and for him. And that's how she begins to see, well, this is an area that I could get into, the directing of films. And there were very few women directors at the time, and certainly none as good looking as Jill Craigie. I
Yes.
mean, she was in one of her husband's films.
Hmm.
She could have had a film career, but she didn't really like the acting. She didn't like
Hmm.
what she thought of as the artificiality of it. When her
Hmm.
her daughter started dating, if you can believe this or not, Sean Connery, Jill was very disapproving. Oh, not an actor. Those actors are unreliable. You don't want to marry someone like Sean Connery. I mean, this is before he was, famous,
Yeah.
before he did all of
The
the wonderful
James
films
Bond
he was
things.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, the James Bond films.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jeffrey Dell wrote one of the classic novels about Hollywood called Nobody Ordered Wolves. And it's about it's about a film company, where they have this script where and they have to find that they're looking for all these wolves. It's very complicated. How do you actually get a bunch of wolves into your film? You go to the zoo. How do you, is there wolf trainers? What do so he goes through all this stuff.
Uh-huh.
But the funny thing about the novel is a joke. They never actually used the wolves in the movie. And that was typical of the film. It still in some
Uh-huh.
ways is, that you shoot miles and miles of film. And a lot of what thought you were was so great ends up on the cutting room floor.
Uh-huh.
So she became in the 40s famous, Jill did, because she did this film, The Way We Live. And it's about Plymouth, which is Michael Foot's hometown, recovering from the war. It was one of the cities in England that was virtually destroyed
Uh-huh.
in the Second World War by German bombing. And so the question was, how do we rebuild this? And that's where Mumford comes in.
Yeah.
Where people are thinking about what is the model for the new city for Plymouth. They don't follow Mumford's model, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But Jill gets very interested and interviews a lot of architects and writes a film and directs a film about the rebuilding of Plymouth
Uh-huh.
and what politically, and that's where she meets Michael Foot.
Uh-huh.
And at the same time, she's very involved in, I think, given her own struggles as a woman, she's become very interested in this, what it was a derogatory term then, the suffragettes. I don't think anyone thinks of it as they preferred to call themselves suffragists, votes for women.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Suffragism, not suffragette, and
Uh-huh.
especially men had sort of made fun of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And so she goes about interviewing people like the Pankhursts.
Because they were still alive and
They were still
available.
alive. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is she's interviewing them about what's happening before World War I.
Yeah.
And the struggles, women throwing bricks through windows, women being force-fed in prisons because of they're protesting and they get into prison. And she wants to do a great documentary about all these women. And she kept transcripts of all these interviews, which I read while I was doing my
Uh-huh.
biography of Jill. But then she gets caught in a power struggle. Who has the right, in a sense, the moral right, not legal right, really, the moral right to tell this story? And Sylvia Pankhurst has a certain vision of how women got the vote. And she's in conflict, in fact,
Oh,
with her mother, Emily
a conflict within the movement.
within the
It's-
movement, within the
yeah.
movement.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, she's not able to make the film. Ultimately, it leads to the book that she works on for decades
Uh-huh.
called Daughters of Dissent, about how women got the vote. But I think that experience and all of the misogyny and the problem, and even when she got these feature articles about her as a film director, it was look at how beautiful she is, and she commands 40 men on a movie set and all that. And she just kind of, she wanted the publicity, she wanted the films
Uh-huh.
to be successful, but it left a bad taste.
Uh-huh.
And there were so many men who either wanted to just take her to bed or exploit her in some way. And while she's making this film, The Way We Live, which is available, by the way, on YouTube, you could see it,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um, she meets Michael Foot, and he's in this film, The Way We Live, in giving this really very stiff speech.
Did he
It's
look?
really
I'm
interesting.
curious. Because I moved to Britain about when Michael Foot was the leader of the Labour parties. So he was a very distinctive appearance in those later days, big glasses and white
Yeah.
hair and stuff. So even though I wasn't really I didn't really pay a lot of attention when I came across your book. I mean, I immediately knew and recognized Michael Foote.
Yeah.
Was
Yeah.
What was he like as a, considerably younger man when she met him?
Yeah. When she met him, he was a considerably younger man. He came from a well-established Plymouth family, not upper class, middle class, liberals. They were liberals. They
Uh-huh.
weren't labor.
Uh-huh.
He was the black sheep because
Uh-huh.
his brothers ran as liberals. This was right after the war, and he ran as a labor candidate.
And there it was the Liberal Party.
The Liberal Party, which was,
Party,
there's a
yes.
wonderful
Yeah.
book by George Dangerfield about the death of the Liberal Party. They were
Yeah.
once the majority party.
Yeah.
And so the couple of the brothers are running. It's a big family, the Foote family, and they're making fun of Michael. He's the runt, and there's no way he's going to win. He's running against someone who is in the Conservative Party cabinet. He's a
Oh.
cabinet minister. And Michael is this upstart kid as far as they're concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have this election, and there's this huge labor landslide. That's the beginning of the welfare state. Right after the war, Churchill
Oh, I
loses the
see.
election.
Right.
Churchill loses the election to everyone's shock because he's a war hero. But people are tired of sacrifice, tired of not having a good health system, unemployment benefits, and all the rest. The conservatives have been in power for many, many years. And to everyone's amazement, except Jill and Michael, they're not married yet. To everyone's amazement, he wins a labor seat in Plymouth, a conservative bastion, and his two brothers lose. The
Ooh,
liberals lose.
Christmas dinner
And
that year.
yeah, exactly. Really interesting. He was, like, to her, a gift from heaven. Why? Because she did have those leftist principles and feminist principles. She's definitely a woman of the left. But he was more than that. He had been editor of the London Evening Standard for this tycoon, Lord Beaverbrook, this what they called a press lord, very much like Rupert Murdoch, very
Uh-huh.
much in that vein. And even though his politics were, Beaverbrook's were conservative, he really got a kick out of Michael Foote. He hired Michael Foote the day that he said, well, what's in the newspapers today? That was his sort of the interview. And Michael just rattled off everything that was significant with such, brilliance. He was so articulate, so quick. Beaverbrook essentially fell in love with him, and Beaverbrook fell in love with Jill too. So one of the jobs he gave Michael was as a book reviewer, but more than that, he was really in charge of the literary page of the London Evening Standard.
Uh-huh.
He was a literary man. He was a wit. In the early days of television, he was a TV star.
Uh-huh.
He was on what was called the Brains Trust with prominent historians and other intellectuals and so on. Later, he was thought of as an old fuddy-duddy who didn't adapt to media, who wasn't any good. But in the age of talking heads, which is what early 50s television in Britain was, he was tremendously popular. So he was the complete package.
Uh-huh.
He was the future. He was the Labor Party. He wrote for the Tribune, a leftist journal, which
Uh-huh.
still exists. And who wrote for the Journal? George Orwell. He was a friend of George Orwell's. You see, he was. There's nobody like him in the United States with that kind
Uh-huh.
of both literary and political power.
Right. Yes, I think that's so.
And as well as falling in love with the man, of course, it was what he stood for. And I think what she saw was, am I going to beat my brains trying to get into the film industry? She knew people, producers who, there's a heartbreaking letter she writes to one of them about she has these ideas for films, do this and that. And he writes a polite letter back, but it becomes very clear that I saw from his correspondence that he was polite to her, but he didn't think women should really be in the be in charge in the film industry.
In charge, yes. That's
Yeah. So she felt she didn't know how far she could go, how good she could be. She did see people, directors like Carol Reed, the director of The Thin Man.
Mhm.
They went through an apprenticeship system. They did all kinds of menial labor and eventually worked themselves up. There was no such apprenticeship system for women. It was a fluke in a sense that because she was married to Jeffrey Dell, the
Yeah.
screenwriter and director. They did a film together called The Flemish Farm. She got some notoriety, but she realized, eventually divorced Jeffrey Dell before
Mhm.
marrying Michael Foote. She realized it was going to be really tough, really tough. And I think she made a decision, which other women make. And it's not always women in a marriage. Look at Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf.
Mhm. Yes.
It's
Yeah,
not that
good
he didn't have
example.
his own business and so on, but he knew she was great.
Yeah.
He never had any doubt. And whatever it took, and that's usually the woman's role. It's usually the woman who says, whatever it takes, I don't think I can get there, but my husband can get there.
Mhm.
And that's what to a large extent, that marriage became.
Mhm.
She was never really less than her own woman, but politics did mean doing things, being thought of as I say, Jill Foote, not Jill Craigie,
Mhm.
even though she continued to use that name, Jill Craigie. So that created, and I don't think he ever quite saw it. You sort of alluded to this. It became very complicated. And what became
Yes.
complicated was a marriage. You see, she dies, and he's filled with enormous grief. This is the end of the 1990s. And he wants tributes. And so when I come along, I didn't know this at the time. I'm responding to the
Mhm.
obituary and to my contact with her. But as his stepdaughter tells me, he's looking for ways. It's a kind of restitution
So there's
that to
is
a
this
certain
guilt? Does
extent,
he feel
yes,
yeah.
guilt, because she does everything for him. She's trying to write her book, Daughters of Dissent, about votes for women, and he'll come into her study and say, "Coffee?" You know,
I've been there.
yeah, yeah.
It'd
And
be
so,
nice to have a cup of tea just now.
yeah, that kind of thing. Very polite,
Yeah.
you know, but he, it took
And
me a
now
while
in
to understand
Mister,
this.
he would
Yeah,
realize how much she'd done. Now, there are plenty of men who would simply replace as
that's right.
res
Yeah.
now, see, it's interesting to me. Is that because he had feminist principles or had other people? I mean, that he
It is
actually
interesting.
yeah.
There were a lot of women who would have been happy to step into that role.
Mhm.
He had a whole cadre of women around him, Labor Party women,
Mhm.
who protected him, secretaries and women, who he could have married and didn't, because he did recognize, in a sense, her greatness, that she was
That's
irreplaceable.
very touching. I
Yeah, it
I
was. I was very
and it's
touched. Yeah.
unusual, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And yeah, it's a fascinating, complex story. To some extent, it's like the Carlyle marriage, when Jane
mhm.
Carlyle dies and
Yep.
Thomas Carlyle realizes, boy, I've been a shit. I didn't treat her right. You know, that Michael couldn't get to. And when that got into the biography of Jill,
Right,
it
that's what you
really,
need to tell us about because you
yeah,
ended up not on
yeah,
good terms with Michael
that's right.
because even though you
That's
were
right.
doing he said didn't he say kind
Yeah.
of warts and all, tell the
Yes, that's
story
right.
as you
That's
see
right.
it?
Yeah. And he never imagined that I would come to a view of his own marriage, which showed, and his stepdaughter once said this to me early on when I was working on the biography, and it really shocked me. I didn't know what to make of it. but we all went on holiday to Dubrovnik, all of us, me too. And she said she was talking to one of the Labor Party people who had been invited on this trip. And the wife of one of these politicians said, Michael's one of the most selfish people in the world. And I thought, what? Because the guy seemed so generous. He always wanted to pick up the check in the restaurant. He was so
seems like open
wonderful about,
arms with you.
yes, and with me, and his memories of Jill were so wonderful and so on. But when I began to interview, especially some of the women who knew Jill, they would talk about how much he sacrificed to make him happy. And this had been his experience as a man because his mother was very much like this. And so he took it for granted. And one of the contentions was, I don't say this in my biography, Jill Craigie, exactly, but why didn't she finish her book, Daughters of Dissent? She had only a couple of chapters to go. There are all kinds of reasons. She was one of those biographers who there's always something else, there's something new, or someone else has come out with a book that you have to take into account. And this can go on forever and ever. If you wanted to, you can make it your life's purpose. And Jill is kind of like that. So what does a husband do in the case like that? I mean, imagine Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf, for example. And so what I'm thinking about when I'm writing the book, and I'm more explicit about this in A Private Life of Michael Foot, the second book, but even in the Jill Craigie biography, I never quite come out and say this, but essentially here's what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is in 1992, Michael retired. So this is about 7-8 years before Jill dies. He retires from Parliament. He doesn't retire really as a public figure, but I mean, as a MP, he's done. And she's writing this book. He's very interested in it. She gives him stuff to read and he edits it and that kind of thing. But, there's this coffee business. There are these social obligations business. There are the parties business, having parties, dinner parties, all kinds of things.
Which I'm sure she organized.
Yes, absolutely. She was a great cook, among other things, and a gardener. And what Michael never did, I don't think it ever occurred to him to do something like this, to say to her, why don't you just go off and finish this book? We've got the money. I mean, he wasn't a wealthy man, but they were okay. They were comfortable. I'll find somebody to take care of me because he couldn't cook. He couldn't boil an egg. He couldn't do anything domestically. When she tried to get him to serve coffee, for example, he broke the coffee cups. He was just totally clumsy, just the stereotype of a male who knows nothing in the kitchen. And he never did that. Now, maybe she would never have finished the book anyway, but it seems to me, at least another kind of man might have said,
what would it take to allow
what would it take for you to get this book done? And there's no reason in the world after he retires from Parliament why he couldn't have said that to her.
Yeah. And he didn't.
And he didn't. And when I made that, by implication, it's in the Craigie biography, but it's explicit in A Private Life of Michael Foot. When I did that, it offended his amour propre, his fairy tale about what the marriage was. It's not that there wasn't love. It wasn't that they didn't love one another, but that he failed her in one fundamental respect, and that was just devastating. And the reason why he could get away with it in his own mind, I think, and never come to terms with it. First of all, I'm this American. I'm an outsider. As much as he, likes me and has made everything possible for me to do this biography. And most people, by the way, most of his friends thought it wouldn't be an honest book because they'd see me with him and they'd think, oh, well, he's been co-opted. He'll write the typical authorized biography. And I think the reason Michael couldn't see it because there was this love-hate relationship with Jill's daughter, who was by the first husband. She was a stepdaughter. And Julie, who's still alive, who took one time she thought of acting too, and she became a professional photographer, and she called herself Julie Hamilton. Julie kept saying to me, there's more to this marriage than Michael will ever say, and there's more to this marriage than Michael will ever admit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I listen to Julie a lot, and most people, to be honest, most of Michael's friends hated her because she never bought into the Michael Foot myth that this is a great man.
So on the whole, people surrounding him were of that ilk.
Very much.
Yeah, the
And
great
they
man.
would call Julie, a liar.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of things that Julie told me, they said it's not true. And Michael never called her a liar, but he often said to me, be careful about Julie and what Julie
Uh-huh.
says.
Mm-hmm.
And one time we had this joking with Julie in the room, and I was talking to Michael about Jill, the mother. I once said to both of them, I said, I'm going to have to write this biography in 2 columns because their view was so different. And so when it came to it, there was this showdown with Michael, in which he was upset about the treatment of the marriage, and he banged his hand on the table, and he said, this has to come out, which was itself a revelation. Because the whole business has started with him saying, it's your book. I've been a journalist. I know what it's like. I don't want other people to muck with my stuff. I won't muck with yours. And then he says, this has to come out. And I said to him, you don't have to take my word for it, Michael. Take Jill's. Because one of the things I had was Jill's letters to her daughter. And it was the letters that corroborated what the daughter had said. And he could never
so
face
tricky
that.
when there's documentation.
Yes, he could never face that the same way when I came home one day from the Public Records Office in London. And I said to Michael, I said, he was born in 1913 and he thought that Jill was born in 1914. And I said to Michael, I said, I found out that Jill was born in 1911, which made her older than him. And he said, no, that's not right. And I said, you let me go through the house. I said, I found several passports. They all say 1911. He said, no, that's not right. And he wouldn't accept the documentation. Obvious. I spoke to one of Jill's friends, Jenny Springer, a very close friend. And Jenny said, oh, I knew that. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew it except Michael Foot.
Except Michael Foot. That really
Yeah.
mattered. Well, the things that people, there are a number of things that you uncover in the book. Maybe we shouldn't do too many spoilers, but, I couldn't help but think and go back to the material, the passages or the section about the rape, both because you said it was really important in her life. I realized that the man involved was someone who's one of another book I really like, which he was the author of, but also because in the news right now, there's a lot about Alice Munro, the Canadian writer, and about the way people keep really terrible secrets within families. So I did want, in light of that, I thought that was something worth talking about.
She was raped by Arthur Koestler. No doubt about it that it was a rape. The only question is exactly what Michael Foot knew. And in fact, nobody would have known about this if Michael hadn't talked about it at one point. But there was a blindness in him that, it had to come out, just like he wanted the biography of her. It all had to come out. But he never was really prepared to understand that. And Jill, like many women, lived with this secret of the rape for many, many years. And later, in fact, a Koestler biographer, Arthur Scammell, essentially accused her of making it up.
And the thing is, they didn't talk. She didn't do anything about it at the time, and I guess wasn't encouraged to. It sounds like because he was a great man.
That's right. It would have created real complications. Koestler was a close friend who also wrote for Tribune, Michael's magazine. Michael was editor of that at one time. It would have created, a real problem politically.
It's like a political and social problem. So they let him get away with it. And it sounds like he was likely to have done the same thing with other women. He sounds like
another woman came forward with, and with a similar story, one woman who was able to jump out of the car when he started to make his moves on her. Uh, but it's pretty clear. Finally, Koestler's biographer, Scammell, we had a set to about it, and Scammell finally, more or less grudgingly accepted that this was, a reality, that it actually had happened. But it was just a good example of what Jill had to face.
Yeah. It's
It
quite
was,
chilling, actually, because I
it
went back
is.
and read it, because this was a man, she was trying to, do the right, be, pleasantly social, because it was her kind of role.
That's right.
And he felt entitled to do it.
Well, and it had to have been really violent because Jill could handle herself.
Mm.
She had, worked in the film industry.
Yes.
She had gone through the
It
war.
wasn't new to her to have to deal
It
with
wasn't new to her
male
for a man to
aggression
do
of some
such a
sort.
thing.
Yeah.
She was no
Yeah.
naive. She was a
Yeah.
mature woman. And when a woman is mature, that's also often the reaction in the culture, not so much now after Me Too, but it used to be, oh, well, she was old enough to take care of herself. How could she, she must have done something to lead him on,
Yeah.
that sort of reaction. So she knew that she would have to also deal with all that. And even when this story came out in the 80s, early 90s, she had to contend with biographers like Scammell, who, were scoffing at well, why does she come forward with this story now if it happened decades ago? Why, she must be calling attention to herself, and it wasn't even her. It was her husband who had first, intimated what had happened. And so she was kind of stuck.
Yeah. Terrible position to be in. But let's have some, something. I'm not sure I should have brought that up towards the end, because the really great thing about this story is what an inspiring, what a woman with so many interests and so much talent, and where you really just want to meet her and talk to her,
That
and so that's my reaction. Is
Well, when I met her, I fell in love with her. I mean, she was,
Yeah. I want to see her garden. I want to know what she was
much
cooking. I want to,
exactly.
talk to her about the early feminists.
That's exactly what she was like. I say in the book, A Private Life of Michael Foote, when she was talking about this miners' cottage they had in Wales when he had this Welsh constituency, and she said she was wanting to sell it. She said, great writers retreat. She looked at me with those big eyes. Everyone talked about her big eyes. And, I didn't have the money, otherwise I would have said, I'll buy it.
You would have got the checkbook out right then.
Yeah. But that feeling, and once I started to do the bio, no wonder men were so, interested in her, wanted to, to date her, to bed her, to marry her. She was so attractive. And yet, I shouldn't say yet, she was so intelligent.
Yeah,
Um,
she really was kind of a woman of just so many parts, and I think that I really think that reading about someone like her be helpful. I mean, and kind of exciting for women now.
she was a William Morris socialist.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is socialism wasn't just abstract ideas. People should be equal, or there should be, free public health or things. She was a William Morris socialist, which meant you had to try to make every day beautiful.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
plates you ate on, the clothes you wore, the house you lived in, anything you could do on a daily basis was part of her socialism. And
Yeah.
that just
The
made her
grace and beauty of life.
exactly. Yeah.
And that's just, I find that really uplifting, and so I'm going to urge people to, get to know Jill Craigie, and then, maybe we'll find this book of hers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Since Carl and I have been on a quest to locate the final manuscript of Jill's book so that I could publish it, because obviously it clearly deserves to be published, and it would be a tribute to her that
Yeah, I
really
think so. Yeah.
should
Yeah.
exist. But in the meantime, We have your wonderful biography, To Be a Woman, The Life of Jill Craigie. Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at KarenChristensen.substack.com.